Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Clayton Rose. I'm the president of the college. This is one of the great evenings in the life of a great university or college where we're able to celebrate the accomplishments and remarkable career thus far. Robert and I were talking about that at dinner, so far, of one of our colleagues. And we are thrilled that you are here. We're here tonight for the George Lincoln Skolfield Jr. Professorship in Religion Inaugural Lecture. That professorship, as some of you heard a little earlier this evening, was created by Lydia Schofield Turner in honor of her nephew, George Lincoln Skolfield Jr., class of 13, and to honor their family. They were a prominent shipbuilding family in and around Brunswick for hundreds of years. Their home, the historic Schofield Whittier House, is on Park Row and is currently under the auspices of the Penobscot Historical Society. There have been some very prominent Bowdoin faculty that have occupied this chair, including Jim Abramson in economics, Jim Moulton in biology, and Steve Cerf in German. And our newest Schofield professor is Robert Morrison, and he is an inspired choice for this honor. He is a truly interdisciplinary, collaborative, and innovative scholar. While physically located in the religion department, and he is chair there and does do work there, his work also focuses on the interplay of the relationship among religions, Judaism and Islam in particular, as well as with science and with history. His 2007 book about the influential 14th century Shiite scholar called Islam and Science, The Intellectual Career of Nizam ad-Din al-Nisaburi, received an International Book of the Year and Islamic Studies Award in 2008 from the nation of Iran. Robert was the only American to receive the award that year. And his most recent book, published in 2016 by the University of California Press, is called Astronomy in al-Andalus, Joseph Ibn Nachmias's The Light of the World. And I hope I didn't butcher that too badly, Robert. Robert is a cherished teacher at Bowdoin, whose students describe his classes as fascinating and thought-provoking. He is known for his willingness to engage with students on issues that they feel are important to their lives, as well as to the scholarship and thought processes that Robert wants to drive them through. He is beloved and respected by his colleagues as well, many of whom are with us tonight, and known among his peers for his warmth, his humor, and his thoughtfulness. Robert was chosen to deliver the address at Convocation in 2015, my first as Bowdoin's president, and it was a powerful talk entitled Uncomfortable Voices about the necessity of expressing, listening to, and engaging with viewpoints that may be disturbing or provocative. His work is also, and his life are also examples of bridging cultures, both in how we do it and as a living example of that. And in our world today, I think there is almost nothing more important than coming to terms with that challenge. Robert received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, his Master of Philosophy, and his PhD from Columbia, and came to us from Whitman College in 2008. And we are very lucky to have him as a colleague. I'm very pleased to welcome to our stage our George Lincoln Skolfield Jr. Professor of Religion, Robert Morrison.
My work was once somewhat complimented as recondite yet funky. I'm going to try to pump up the funk while holding the reconditeness in check to as much as I can. For a decade, I've been working on scholarly intermediaries between the Ottoman Empire. Is there a laser point? Oh, yeah. Yeah, cool. Between the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Europe in the decades before and after 1500. So I had to go back to Germany to get this is actually, they label it in German as the Ottoman kind of kingdom. Constantinople is right about there. That's a key point for where I'm studying. I'm studying people coming from the island of Crete, which is down there. And then all the way up here, we have Venice and the area around it. So those are kind of the three nodal points in the kind of the community of scholars I'm looking at. This project grew out of my attempt to answer a decades-long question in the history of science and Islamic societies. namely the need for a historical explanation for the numerous parallels that scholars have noticed between the astronomy of Islamic societies and that of Renaissance Europe, including the work of Nicholas Copernicus, who died in 1543. Copernicus is renowned for his sun-centered arrangement of the planets, and he is seen to represent the Renaissance spirit in that he both re-engaged with and then superseded the classical heritage. Specifically Ptolemy, who flourished between 125 and 150, specifically Ptolemy's Almagest, the most influential astronomy text of classical antiquity. But what Copernicus actually did, however, was not at all as simple as taking a fresh look at an old text. Rather, 20th century scholarship on Copernicus has shown that his astronomy was an adaptation of a great deal of 13th, 14th, and 15th century Earth-centered Islamic astronomy. The numerous technical parallels between Islamic astronomy, that is the astronomy of Islamic societies, and that of Copernicus, they're really beyond dispute. The challenge, though, has been finding an organic link between Islamic societies, like, say, the Ottoman Empire, and the Veneto, again, kind of the greater Venetian metropolitan area. The Veneto includes a town called Padua, and there's a famous university there where Copernicus studied between 1501 and 3. Building on the scholarship of my senior colleague, Zvi Langerman, and a late Italian scholar, Umberto Cassuto, I found a network of scholars which does explain the exchange of the relevant theoretical astronomy from the Ottoman Empire, again, the dominant Islamic empire at the time, to the Veneto. The goal of my research, though, on the connection between Copernicus and Islamic astronomy is not to take Copernicus down a notch. Rather, it serves to show, it serves to show that the Renaissance was more multicultural and more transregional than we thought. Tonight, as I discuss the broader intellectual conversation that took place in the scholarly network I'm studying, I think the Renaissance will not seem completely European. Now, why are we talking about astrology? From a present or presentist perspective, Copernicus and theoretical astronomy, you know that's a big deal. But from the perspective of the historical actors, theoretical astronomy might not have seemed that important. As I continue to research and write, astrology, though, has become increasingly prominent in my descriptions and analysis of scholars' concerns. The eminent historian of astronomy, Otto Neugebauer, famously wrote that the study of wretched subjects, by which he meant inter alia astrology, could tell us much about that which is not wretched, by which he meant astronomy. The broader conversation I found in this network was indeed multidisciplinary. It covered, besides astrology, medicine, technology, and religious thought. And it was also multidirectional. In many cases, the Jewish and Muslim scholars in the network I'm studying were very interested in the intellectual life of Christian Europe in the late 1400s and early 1500s. To many of us, criticizing astrology is easy. But to the historical actors around 1500, astrology was more like the modern financial industry, particularly just before 2008. There were some real problems, particularly with arcane predictions, that's in astrology, perhaps analogous to derivatives trading. But the Renaissance could not do without astrology, and we at Bowdoin depend on finance. And we do. This is an outline of my lecture. I've road mapped it by almost in every slide. There should be a heading for one of these parts, so if you start seeing one Roman numeral 4, you're almost done. Okay. All right. Now, Introduction to Astrology, Part 1. When I refer to astrology, I and the historical actors mean the science of judicial astrology, which aimed to make forecasts on the basis of the positions of the planets. Inasmuch as there was a financial crisis of astrology, it was over judicial astrology. The natural premises of judicial astrology, of forecasting, and these were that there were connections between the planets' motions and events on Earth, these weren't controversial. Not everyone I'm going to talk about tonight supported astrological forecasting, but even opponents of astrology nevertheless acknowledged that there were connections between the planets' motions and the Earth. Such connections, even if unintelligible to humans, could be how God affects change. The last finance analogy. So basically, even to the opponents of astrology, they were basically saying there is an economy and investing can work, even if certain strategies don't. Now, there were many commonalities between the astrological theory and practice of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The influential practice of conjunctionist astrology appeared first in Islamic societies, drawing on pre-Islamic Persian foundations, and then came to enter Latin and Hebrew astronomy texts as well. So here, what you see, the key here is that Jupiter and Saturn, this is from the point of view of modern astrology, but the point is clear. They're in conjunction, that is, they've come together, and that's, astrologically speaking, a big deal. In conjunctionist astrology, conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter in various parts of the belt of the 12 constellations of the zodiac. So what am I talking about? What I'm saying is here, this is a conjunction right here, this big fat fiery thingy. That's a conjunction of Jupiter and the Sun. So other planets besides Saturn and Jupiter can have conjunctions. And they're in conjunction you can see the constellation, the zodiacal constellation of Taurus. Taurus is really the background and the conjunctions in front. So conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn and other planets in various parts of the belt of the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and you can see some of, here's Aries, right? Right before Taurus. You could just imagine the rest of the belt. They could effect large-scale historical transformations, according to this idea. Because Jupiter and Saturn were the slowest-moving known planets, with periods of 20 and 30 years respectively, their conjunctions were fewer and thus more significant than conjunctions involving other planets. This is also a lot simpler. Now, predictions based on conjunctions differ from the more personalized astrology that flourishes in newspapers and online. Not only is conjunctionist astrology simpler, it's thus better for this talk than horoscopes, it's less bad for me as an individual. And you can see what this is like. Yeah, I'm glad I didn't listen to this before I got married. Okay. Okay. Conjunctionist astrology, here's some more though. It's good to marry here's a good thing, here's why you should marry a Leo. All right, conjunctionist astrology is actually more akin, from a modern perspective, to the dawning of the age of Aquarius. It may or may not have happened actually, but when it does, it's going to affect everyone, not just Cancers and Leo. Okay. My research, now we're gonna move to part 2, conjunctionist astrology in my network of scholars. My research has found that a conversation about astrology. There's agreement in this conversation as well as minor and major disagreements. Right now we're just talking big picture. Let's start with some points of general agreement about conjunctionist astrology shared between the Ottomans and the scholar in the network I study. These general points were also shared and criticized by Christian scholars. So I guess we're at part 2. See, we're on the way to the Ottoman court at this point. All right. The Ottomans copied and studied older astrology texts in Arabic and Persian that contained theories of conjunctionist astrologers. More interesting to me, Ottoman court astrologers also composed almanacs, known in Ottoman as well as Arabic and Persian as a taqwim, for each year. So got to get out of here. Let's check out my. Hopefully, inshallah, see there I said it. We can look at one of these. It's hard to see. I guess maybe we can go to full screen. No, I'm not gonna have that kind of luck. All right, what you can see, this is part of a page of one of these almanacs. These yearly almanacs indicate, and this is one I've been beginning to study, and they're in Ottoman Turkish, these indicate that conjunctionist astrology was part of Ottoman astrological practice and not just a topic of study. So you know that the author of the Taqwim was actually committed to conjunctionist astrology. You can see, one can read in this almanac that a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, particularly when the conjunction occurred against the background of the sign of Aries, that was particularly auspicious for the Ottomans. And a Hebrew astrology text written by, the text is called Sefer HaGoralot, or the Book of Lots, written by the key member of the network. His name in Hebrew was Moses Galeano. He called himself Musa Jalinus when he wrote in Turkish and Arabic, and he died after 1542. He said the same thing. Galeano Jalinus had a remarkable ability to self-promote that would have made him, I think, a bad fit at our college, but he certainly had a lot to say about his access to the Ottoman court, and it's probably why they're agreeing, why the Taqwim and Galeano Jalinus agree. The shared conjunctionist astrology extended to more frequent, less momentous conjunctions, and there one sees a little daylight, so to speak, between Galeano Jalinus's Book of Lots and the Almanac. We're going to compare passages. The Turkish translation I'm going to show you is coming from right around here, but the English is not sideways. All right, then let's go to, whoops, sorry. There we go. Yes, slideshow. Okay. Boom, boom. Okay, what's gonna, we already did that, we already did this, we did this, we did this. Okay, what's gonna happen here? So we're gonna be reading that Mercury and Jupiter, you can see in the almanac, are at trines. What does trines mean? Trines means when you have two planets that are separated from Earth's perspective by like Mars and Mercury, they're at trines. They're separated by 120 degrees. Venus and Mercury are at sextiles, separated by 60. That's what those terms mean. They're, degrees between the planets. These angles, when they're at 60, 120, those are a big deal, astrologically speaking. The almanac reads, Mercury and Jupiter at trines indicates that there will be extreme friendship and accord among minor ministers and writers and people of the pen and great ministers and judges and scholars and people of asceticism and piety. And they also indicate much activity for tax collectors and professionals and merchants. They indicate the arrival of workers and those of good experience. They indicate the profusion of those who gain, and they indicate the seizure of noble power, and they indicate that noble mosques and madrasas, Islamic schools, will be found. Here's what Galeano Jalinus had to say. On your right, from the Book of Lots. The conjunction of Mercury and Jupiter indicates humans' pursuit of wisdom, literature, and doctrines and secrets, and it indicates plagues, all the more so if a particular of Mars indicates the air's strong heat, which makes all of us sick. Their being at trines and sextiles indicates humans' many doubts about religions and deceptions. And if they're at deciles, which is these two planets are 36 degrees apart, then kings seek wisdom, books, and crafts, and they work at them. Women seek religion, product of his times. The key here is that the almanac's predictions for trines matched what Galeano Jalinus was saying about deciles. This is a difference, but it's not a huge difference because Mercury is a fast-moving planet. You know that if Mercury's in retrograde for you right now. If Mercury and Jupiter were going to be at trines in 1453, the year of the almanac for which the almanac was composed, they would also have been at deciles in that year, most likely. Insight into why we've got these differences comes, I think, from looking at what the text said about a Mars-Saturn conjunction. There was also to be a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in 1453, and the almanac forecast destruction for that year, probably because both Mars and Saturn are malefic, kind of bad planets. The Book of Lots also explained that Mars-Saturn conjunctions meant destruction. The almanac noted that conjunction was going to occur against the background of the sign of Cancer, whereas Galeano Jalinus said that if the conjunction occurred in a masculine sign, which Cancer was not, then the king would appoint a man in whose sign the conjunction would occur. Now see, Galeano Jalinus's broader description of astrology was completely irrelevant to the picture, to the particulars of 1453, which we all know turned out to be a very good year for the Ottomans. bad for the Byzantines. Okay for the Jews. All right. Scholarship, so scholarship on these almanacs has found that the forecasts in the almanac serve to legitimate the Ottoman rulers and their decisions. Sometimes the sultan, who unfortunately is never named in the almanacs I've looked at, is called the master of the conjunction. Like a conjunction is an indication of a new king. But in certain circumstances, Gellinus recognized the connection between astral forces and the death of a king, hence politics. In the Book of Lots, Galiano Gellinus wrote about his understanding of how the astral forces led to the death of the Mamluk Sultan al-Mansur Qalawun, who died in 1290 in Cairo. The Mamluks were a dynasty of sultans in Egypt and Syria who originated as highly trained slaves, so you'd think they'd have learned. Galiano Gellinus said he found the astrological interpretation of Qalawun's death written somewhere else. But the major Mamluk sources don't attribute his death to the stars. What we see, though, is that Galiano Gellinus is more interested in talking about astrology, willing to use it to explain the past, but warier of using it to forecast. Let's move to part 3. And in part 3, we're going to be talking, why do we do that yet? Part 3, we're talking about forecasts based on conjunctionist astrology. Opposition is in part 3. So this is what I call like the, what is this? This is the post-colonic of my talk in the sense that it comes after the colon. So it's the post-colonic. And we're looking at opposition here, okay? So we're looking at opposition and we're looking at opposition to forecasts based on conjunctionist astrology. Okay, back to this guy. In astronomy, opposition is when two planets are diametrically opposite in their paths around the Earth or the Sun in modern astronomy. To an astrologer, planetary oppositions are significant. I'm using, though, this astronomical configuration as a metaphor for just Galiano Gellinus's opposition to conjunctionist astrology. It comes in some sections of a fascinating text called Puzzles of Wisdom, or Ta'alumot Chokhmah in Hebrew, a text that had no precedent in the history of Hebrew literature. Drafted around 1500 and completed a few decades later, Puzzles was organized around errors in reasoning, not scholarly disciplines. Galiano Gellinus brought examples from different disciplines, including astrology and religion, to illustrate pitfalls of logic. My senior colleague, Tzvi Langerman, has suggested that the use of logic as an organizing principle reflects Galiano Gellinus. You know, he's originally from Istanbul, dies on Crete. Nevertheless, he was clearly acquainted with Renaissance Italy, as evidenced by his reference to Latin texts that were never translated into Hebrew or into an Islamic language. In preparing the lecture for tonight, I noticed reading Puzzles of Wisdom again. I noticed that Galiano Gellinus uses this word bussola for compass, which is like the Italian word for compass, and not the Hebrew word. And he marks it in the text as a foreign word. It's also where I seem to have had my 11th birthday party. Who knew it was so good? Now, mistaken in Galiano Gellinus's view of uses of astrology came up in the section of puzzles where Galiano Gellinus, I'm using again the Hebrew and the Islamic names, criticized those who confused the essential reason with the accidental reasoning in their process of logic. He began by taking Christians and Muslims' charges that Judaism was a superseded religion. Galiano Gellinus called Judaism God's providential concern for Jews' concerns, just as medicine was God's providential concern for the body. Changes in Jewish law and Jewish practice and the existence of other religions weren't an indication of Judaism's deficiencies, irrelevance, nor of Jews' lack of understanding. Rather, these changes were akin to how physicians varied treatments depending on the geographic locale. Physicians' consideration of local factors did not displace the widespread idea that disease had astral causes, but they're not curing by astral causes. God's providence, mediated by the planets, depended on the nation, not so much on the soul. All souls were equal. A page earlier in Puzzles of Wisdom, he had rebutted assertions that Jews were under the rule of Saturn. Rather, what Galeano Gelinos is saying is that Saturn influenced the climate in Israel, but Jews born outside of Israel wouldn't be affected by Saturn. While the planets were necessary to mediate God's providence, planetary conjunctions could not affect Jews' overall fortunes in a way anyone could predict. Galeano did not uphold conjunctionist astrology in Puzzles of Wisdom. Whatever he said in Book of Lots, whatever, he goes, it's possible, and he doesn't think you can forecast political fortunes with conjunctions. It's possible, he writes, that the period of a year of a city be good, and there comes to it iniquities on the part of things that are more general, such as from the direction of the great, middle, or small conjunctions that teach of the rise of religion or of the kingdom of the people of that state. Or maybe these iniquities come from the moment of the city's foundation, or maybe it's from being at a certain angle with a malefic planet, or a lunar eclipse, or a war or famine, or something like that. This difficulty of judging, is that it's necessary to know so many reasons and what emerges from their mixture, because there's no mirror, there's no way to test what you actually know. He has asserted that astrological forecasting, in particular forecasting based on conjunctions, involved too many variables to be truly practicable. Yeah, it's important he's doing it in the context of interreligious dialogue or disputes. But there were other ways to go at it if he had agreed with astrology. For example, a couple of centuries earlier, a Jewish astrologer, Abraham Bar Chia, died in 1136, had developed a slightly different system of conjunctionist astrology so that calculations always worked out to favor the Jews. But Galeano Gelinos seemed to be saying that the forces of planetary conjunctions simply did not affect Jews, and even if they did, there's no way you could make an actionable prediction. Puzzles of Wisdom was not the only case of where interreligious polemics impinged on a critique of conjunctionist astrology. Among Renaissance Christians in the network I'm studying, Pico della Mirandola, who died in 1494, his lengthy disputations against divinatory astrology might, unsurprisingly, include a broadside against conjunctionist astrology. He also is interested in interfaith polemics. Given the known popularity of Abraham ibn Ezra, he was a famous Jewish scholar, died in 1164, wrote in both Hebrew and Latin. Given the known popularity of Ibn Ezra's astrology in Renaissance Italy, and it's true, Pico's choice to attack in the disputations a text allegedly by Ibn Ezra on historical astrology, ostensibly titled De Redemptione Israel, on the redemption of Israel, seemed strategic. In that text, Ibn Ezra used the celestial configurations at Moses' birth as a basis for prediction about the coming of the Jewish Messiah. And around 1470, Isaac Abravanel, scholar in the network known to Pico, also predicted the imminent return of the Jewish Messiah. A critical problem to which Pico referred was that it was very hard to know exactly when Moses was born. And the problem is that the math of Abravanel and Ibn Ezra led to a prediction for the coming of the Messiah in 1464, when Saturn and Jupiter would have been together in Pisces. But the grand conjunction is when Saturn and Jupiter were together against the background of Aries. You kind of need something that big for, the Messiah. Pico pointed out that the impact of these failed predictions on the morale of Jewish society was considerable, particularly in light of the ongoing expulsions from Spain in the 1400s. Because this historical astrology was based on the correlation of historical events with planetary conjunctions, errors in the foundations would be compounded. Again, here's another argument in the network opposed to conjunctionist astrology. Let's move to the next word in my title, occultation. An occultation in astronomy is when one object passes in front of another, thereby hiding the object or planet in back. A solar eclipse, for example, when the moon intervenes between the Earth and the sun, or a lunar eclipse when the Earth intervenes between the sun and the moon, were both understood by the historical actors as occultations and were both of immense astrological and religious significance. Astrology itself, though, from the perspective of the scholars in the network, was not an occult science, in that it was not practiced in secret and didn't depend on properties of matter that were secret or of the planets that couldn't be rendered explicit. Whether or not astrological forecasts were correct, the foundations of astrological forecasting were very clear. Just as interreligious polemics shaped Galeano Gellinus's and Pico's opposition to astrology, debates about the occult shaped a rethinking of astrology. Kabbalah, which is Jewish mystical or esoteric thought and practice, would be understood often as occult, both today and to the network. And if to you occult sounds like a stronger word than mysticism, well, Kabbalah had its critics. Scholars in the network encountered Kabbalah in two ways. First, Kabbalah came to the Eastern Mediterranean via the successive expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And then second, Renaissance Christians in the network, such as Pico della Mirandola, were enthusiasts of the Kabbalah due to its antinomian potential, as a profound connection with God did not seem to Christians to depend on the performance of Jewish law, and because Kabbalah could be used to argue for Christianity against Judaism. For instance, Pico used astrology and Kabbalah to argue that the Sabbath should be observed on Sunday instead of Saturday. How does he do this? Well, by Kabbalistic manipulation of the numerical values of Hebrew letters. What that means is, in Hebrew, the letters of the alphabet, they all have a numerical value, and then you can kind of find out how much words add up to and play around with those numbers. And Kabbalists did that and do that. The numerical value of Jesus, which in Hebrew is Yeshu, can be connected with the numerical value of Shabbat. And he's making this point in his first of the Kabbalistic conclusions I have up on the screen. As the purpose of the Sabbath is to rest, then we can grasp Pico's other thesis up here, that is, whoever joins astrology to Kabbalah will see that to sabbatize and rest becomes more appropriate after Christ on the Lord's Day, and that means on Sunday, than on the day of the Sabbath, which would be Saturday. This argument depends on a fusion of Kabbalah and astrology. This is what I think is going on. Pico depended on the premise, going back to the Romans, that each of the 5 known planets and the sun and the moon, and the 5 known planets are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the sun and the moon too. That adds up to 7, and they all rule a day of the week. You can tell in English that Saturn rules Saturday, the sun rules Sunday, the moon Monday. Then if you get into the Romance languages, like let's take French, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, and vendredi, they connect Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to Mars, mardi, Mercury to mercredi, Jupiter to jeudi, and Venus to vendredi. Okay. So each day of the week is associated with a planet. The Kabbalists talk about these manifestations of the divine names of which there are 10. And Saturn, according to Pico, was always associated with the 7th Kabbalistic manifestation of the divine names. And Saturn rules Saturday. The sun, which was often associated with Jesus, rules Sunday. And moreover, the Kabbalah comes in because according to Pico's fusion of astrology and Kabbalah, the sun is also associated with a manifestation of God's names called Tiferet, or glory. And the Christian Kabbalists associated that manifestation, the 6th, not the 7th, the 6th. They always associated that one with Jesus. So therefore, by Pico's logic, it works. But you know Pico's Jewish contacts weren't going to like this. How do you think he learned about the Kabbalah? The debate over Kabbalah was also among Jews. A Kabbalistic idea that came in for direct attack by Jews and by some of those people I'm studying was this idea that supreme beings like God and the angels could be restored and repaired, the Hebrew word is tikkun, only through human intervention. The Cretan, i.e. connected to Crete, philosopher Elijah Del Medigo, who died in 1497, and he was one of Pico's tutors, found it shocking that humans, for whom self-perfection was a significant challenge, would then be tasked by God with restoring the perfection of higher beings. You can see the problems here. For Del Medico, the correct perspective would be that to the extent that we change for the better, we receive a little bit of God. But God's state of being remains unaffected by human actions. To Del Medico, trying to influence the upper realm, God, the angels, in the way that Kabbalah does, or tries to, smacked of magic and talismans, the occult, or idolatry, which is worse. Another scholar in the network attacked metempsychosis, or in Hebrew, gilgul, this idea that souls transmigrate. Your soul can be reincarnated into someone else. The upside to that is that with metempsychosis, your soul can satisfy commandments that you couldn't get done in this lifetime. This guy, Cohen Ashkenazi, who's again one of the people I'm really looking at, his opposition to metempsychosis hinged on an interpretation of the biblical text for commanding levirate marriage, which is a practice of marrying your deceased brother's childless widow if you're an unmarried man. Because and the purpose is sort of to carry on your late brother's line. Kabbalists would say, because the children of a levirate marriage bear the patronym, like they would be sons and daughters of Robert, except I've already got one, so we're good. Yeah, she's getting it done. But, if I had died and I'm married, right, then all the offspring would be the sons and daughters of Robert. And thus, to a Kabbalist, this practice seems like my soul has transmigrated into the offspring of the levirate marriage. But what Cohen Ashkenazi's doing is he's reading, the Bible. And he's just basically saying, well, if you read the Bible, what it's saying is, no, all that's happening is your brother's name is being perpetuated, not his soul. Thus, to Cohen Ashkenazi, there's no biblical foundation for metempsychosis, and then by extension, a lot of Kabbalah is falling apart. So he doesn't like Kabbalah. And what we've seen in part 4 is that not only, as we saw in part 3, do interfaith polemics have to do with why Galeano, Gellinus, and Pico oppose astrology and oppose conjunctionist astrology. In part 4, we've seen that debates about Kabbalah, debates about an occult or mystical tradition within Judaism are also relevant to views on astrology. Moving to 5. Both the opposition to forecasts based on conjunctionist astrology, as well as the debate among Jewish scholars in the network, and between Jews and Christians over the occult, these things are the background for the third and the most interesting, at least to me, part of the conversation, an interreligious rethinking of astrology. The parallels and connections between Jewish and Christian scholars' rethinking of astrology are why I call this part of the conversation a grand conjunction. To follow along with the astrological leitmotif in my title, a grand conjunction is a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, which you're probably sick of, but if it happens in Aries, that's super good. Here we are. The first data point in the conversation about rethinking astrology was a text called Urim v'Tumim, written in the mid-1400s by Moses Cohen Ashkenazi, and he was the aforementioned opponent of metempsychosis. For Cohen Ashkenazi, astrology, and he was someone who was operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, and as you can tell from my visual, also actually cast horoscopes for well-off Cretans and Venetians, and we have some of them. For Cohen Ashkenazi, astrology to him could be a religious philosophy that could supplant Kabbalah and facilitate a more meaningful observance of Jewish law. Cohen Ashkenazi argued that when astrology was practiced alongside Jewish observance and not as a way to get around Jewish observance, astrology would then be a way to optimize your adherence to Jewish law. By knowing some things about the future of your life and surroundings, you can have a better sense of what God would truly expect. I don't need astrology to know I'm not going to be in the NBA, but some of us would. And I can make better Jewish choices. Graduate school. All right. As such, astrology becomes either a means to or a component of the worship through the intellect, of worshiping God through the intellect, which the Aristotelian tradition in Jewish thought commends. Astrology would give Jews greater insight into the divine wisdom embedded in Jewish law. By advocating astrology only in combination with an observance of Jewish law, Cohen Ashkenazi in this debate is kind of he wrote before Pico, but he's pre-rebutting Pico, because Pico argued that astrology doesn't work on its own. It works only with Christian Kabbalah. For Cohen Ashkenazi, conjunctions, we're back to them, were significant but their effects could be difficult to determine, because no single time of celestial motions resembled another. So in his argument, you can never check yourself. He added that, due to the passage of time and differences among the nations, reliable information about astrological forecasting was hard to come by. But instead of concluding that conjunctionist astrology was hopelessly flawed, he held that the loss of this knowledge was the loss of knowledge. He held that the loss of certain Jewish knowledge, he held that the loss of certain Jewish knowledge was actually the pretext for the composition of Urim v'Tumim. See, the title Urim v'Tumim was a reference to the breastplate worn by the ancient Israelite high priests and unsuccessfully by the Nazis in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Cohen Ashkenazi, like other Jews, believed that the Urim v'Tumim were a forecasting or divinatory instrument. So what he's saying, really, is that astrology was Jews' best alternative to the lost wisdom of the ancient Israelite priesthood. Ashkenazi never claimed that God could not change, albeit through astral causes, the course of life that one's horoscope would seem to set. But it doesn't really matter to him, because to Cohen Ashkenazi, astrology could never be practiced apart from Judaism anyway. And he means Judaism as in obeying Jewish law. Jews from the network, after Cohen Ashkenazi, continued to be involved in this conversation about how to rethink astrology. How do these people know each other? Pico della Mirandola, as I've said, employed Elijah Del Medico, one of the scholars in the network, as a teacher. Marsilio Ficino, another prominent Renaissance thinker who actually saw something of value in astrology, obviously knew Del Medico and was impressed by his acumen in defending Aristotle and opposing Kabbalah at a debate in Pico's house in Florence, and thus in arguing against the idea that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible referred to Jesus. So Elijah Del Medico is Elias, Abraham is another guy I'm looking at, and what they're doing is they're shutting down the Christian Kabbalists. In particular, they're shutting down this guy, and I mean, Ficino admitted they're shutting him down, so they must have. Guglielmo of Sicily, who was also known as Flavius Mithridates, he was a convert to Christianity from Judaism and one of Pico's main informants for Kabbalah. But the Jews win that one, round one. One of Moses Cohen Ashkenazi's sons, Saul Cohen Ashkenazi, was a disciple of Del Medico and most likely, and spent time in Italy as well as Istanbul, and most likely facilitated Del Medico's introduction to Ficino and this guy, Isaac Abravanel. And we've already heard about Isaac Abravanel because Isaac Abravanel was one of those guys Pico was trashing on for trying to predict the Messiah and failing. Isaac Abravanel's son is going to come up in just a minute, and he too was inspired directly by Marsilio Ficino. So now we have a Jew in the network getting ideas from Ficino about rethinking astrology. That's what's going to happen. Pico's disputations, as cutting as they were, did not eliminate Renaissance astrology. Ficino died in 1499, who had close contact with Pico, was critical of some techniques of forecasting, but did believe that astrology could function as a dimension of religious thought. He devoted an entire book of his De Vita, the Book of Life, to the matter of making one's life agree with the stars. He proposed a nuanced acceptance of astrology similar to Cohen Ashkenazi's. Ficino wrote, quote, Abraham and Samuel, and many, Abraham was probably Ibn Ezra, Samuel was probably an astrologer mentioned in the Talmud, and many Hebrew astrologers, trying to work against the threats of Mars and Saturn, used offerings and sacrifices, their minds elevated to God, clearly confirming that precept of the Chaldeans: if you set the mind to a serious work of piety, you'll keep the body also from failing. Implicit was the idea that without pious acts, the mind would fail too and fall under the influence of the stars. We see, just like with Cohen Ashkenazi, that there's a relationship between religious commandments and astral forces. Ficino explained just before the part I quoted that the uselessness of Saturn for a military action was part of the reason why Saturday, the Sabbath, ruled by Saturn, was, for the Jews, a day of leisure. In the Book of Life, Ficino acknowledged that there were times when celestial forces could affect our spirit. For example, certain eras were affected by certain planets, and sometimes the atmosphere then aligned the human spirit more closely with the planets. And both Cohen Ashkenazi and Ficino were struggling with this idea, but wanted to deny this idea that the planets had an influence over your mind if you were doing what your religion asked. They would only affect your life. Although Pico's disputations were directed against the De Vita, Ficino's outlook lived on with Jews in the network who took note of Ficino's De Vita. The aforementioned Isaac Abravanel was a scholar known to Pico who attempted to forecast the Messiah. One of Abravanel's children, who was named Judah Abravanel, but he was known when he wrote in Italian as Leone Ebreo. He was also a physician, and you can tell now it all comes back to Leo's. He composed in 1511 to 12 a lengthy work entitled Dialoghi d'Amore that contained astrological themes. Scholarship, and there's been a lot, on this text has shown that Leone Ebreo took note of Pico's critique of conjunctionist astrology, and Leone Ebreo, according to the scholarship on him, saw the horoscope as a symbolic map of the individual soul, and the scholarship is showing that he's getting this from Ficino. Leone Ebreo wrote, hence, earth is the proper and regular consort of heaven, whereof the other elements are but paramours. For it's upon the earth that heaven begets all or the greater part of its progeny. Also for Leone Ebreo, the relationship between the sun and the moon was analogous to the intellect of the soul. Corporeal beauty to him mirrored planetary beauty. Ashkenazi, Ficino, and Abravanel knew each other or were connected to each other, have all made astrology more acceptable to a Renaissance humanist by focusing on astrology as a means of self-knowledge. So here are some conclusions. First, throughout the talk, we have seen that astrology is a component of interreligious polemics, Kabbalah, and religious philosophy, both Jewish and Christian. So what you're seeing is that Talmud or Sharia or Christian doctrine don't define everything about what a religion says. Particularly, they have ideas about, is astrology good or not, but they're not always definitive. Shahab Ahmed, my late colleague, famously argued in his rapidly well-known book entitled What is Islam? That Islam is to be found in the productive tensions between various scholarly fields, between Islamic law and astrology, for example. And I think the material I've presented tonight bears out his statement for all three religions. The opponents of astrology we've encountered tended not to ground their opposition to astrology in religious law or doctrine. They more often said it just doesn't work. So astrology is part of religion. That's the first big one. Second, the conversation about astrology that I've presented linked Istanbul and Gallienus to Crete and Delmedico, and then on to the Veneto, and also a bit to Florence. Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola's thought was shaped by and shaped intellectual life in Hebrew and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And just as work on the connection between Copernicus and Islamic astronomy has found, the Renaissance was not just about Europe. Thanks. Oh, are we doing quick? Okay. Oh, that's clearer. 48's the new 17. Okay. Do I call him? I guess I know. Nat. Oh, like, does this actually work out? Well, you know, like when I teach astrology, it's one of your 32 courses. Like when you teach astrology, like we have the students do the math and they figure out like a chart and do all the computations. And then like the humanistic element of it is interpreting it, right? And in a lot of ways, it is what you make of it. So there is a long genre of historical astrology that is, and it was one of the earliest genres of historical writing in Arabic, where they would explain world history through planetary conjunctions. And it's doable if the events have already happened, because there are enough conjunctions or there are enough aspects, like angular relationships between the planets, right? There were 5 planets, that they are always able to put something with something. Do you see? Right. And it's, so what you're seeing then is astrology, and I mean, is like, can be a historical, it's a historiographical method. I mean, it's not one I don't think we're teaching now, but it was a historiographical method in classical Islam. Now, in terms of, you know, seeing how the predictions work, I mean, you can imagine what will happen, but there's always enough, right? I mean, I understand the premise of your question. There's always enough, though, give and take. And when you read astrology section, like I have the students do that, and they have to do, like we pretend a student is born, you know, the second week of class in Portland, and we're going to see what happens to them. And every kid gets the same chart, basically, but I get a lot of different answers in the essay for what is going to happen. So do you see what I mean? Like, there's enough softness built into it. It's interpretive. And I think, you know, it remains for people who practice this, like, it's a way of lending, I mean, I'm not advocating it, but it is a way of lending, and, you know, to advocate it, I mean, one cool thing about astrology, the astrology communities, they are fired up, like whenever, you know, Pluto was or wasn't a planet, they had skin in the game, because it, you know, no, but so it's a way of lending meaning to your life, yeah. Anne. Wait, well, sorry, there are 2 Annes. Let's go with Anne and then Anne. Yeah. Anne McBride.
I was just wondering about exactly what you mean by network.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question.
Was it in person?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very good question. And like, how robust is this network? Right. These people knew each other, I would say, and then if I gave a different talk, what I would be telling you is I'm doing research on, part of my research is on commercial contacts in the Eastern Mediterranean. So these scholars are part of larger merchant scholar families, and they're all like going all over the place and doing business with each other. So there's a lot of interreligious commerce. The nature of the data is that, you know, there aren't as many texts that survive, and you just don't get people's diaries or email and stuff like that. So I could say these people knew each other, but I wouldn't say that they were conscious of their being in a network. To make a contrast, later in early modern Europe, there's something called the Republic of Letters. And that's a network of of intellectuals, and I think it extended to the U.S. actually in the 1700s. They knew they were in a network. They were like conscious of belonging to a group. My people aren't. So I'm trying not to put too much weight on the network as an explanatory mechanism. I'm using it more to kind of delineate who I'm going to talk about by saying, if you're in the commercial archives, I'm going to focus on you. If not, forget it. And I'm trying to describe, again, a broad conversation. Like it's, I don't know how much, say, Leone Abreu hung out with Ficino, but all the scholarship knows he read him. So there are the intellectual connections, but I'm trying not to put too much on the social dimension, because for the reasons you imply. Anne.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
For a fascinating talk. I would be interested to hear a little bit about the degree to which you think the emergence of new mathematical interconnections, or the language of mathematics, the language of numbers, the adoption of Arabic numerals in the West is developing sort of a language of sorts that is permitting the adoption of similar methods of studying the heavens, and the degree to which that adoption in the West around 1300 or so is sort of paving the way for new methods of aligning other modes of thinking.
Yeah. No, you're raising, as someone who has struggled, languages are hard. And you always wonder how well the people you're studying actually knew the languages they're writing in or claim to know or whatnot. Yeah. You read, for example, there were Chinese at this famous observatory in northwest Iran that was big in the 13th century. There were Chinese astronomers. Like, okay, how are people talking? How is the communication actually happening here? Right? Chinese is hard, and scientists are often working on, science. But somehow it happens. And I think what I see in this project is when you're looking at more of the technical science, there's really a common, the research agendas are coming together first in one type of astronomy and then later in another. And I think that it's like there's enough commonalities in their sources that, hey, I saw a diagram and they're all huddling around a diagram and exchange is really happening that way. Just like Galeano Gelinas, ostensibly knows Turkish, well, he knows Arabic, but his Arabic sucks. And so you really wonder how, yeah.
Sorry, I might not have.
Maybe I didn't get this. Okay.
I was thinking about numbers and Arabic numerals.
Yeah.
The adoption of sort of new numbering.
Oh, yeah.
As something that would actually sort of pierce through other forms of language.
Let's see. I think it matters. I think it maybe the thing is it's so obvious, like you're so obviously right that might be one thing. But one thing we can do sometimes is like when you're going back to maybe what Nat was talking about, the mathematics behind all these things. Like, so there's a common conversation in astrology. I'm saying that I think it's pretty clear. If you wanted to get more technical, you could start looking at like parameters and figures that they're using to describe the numbers, and sometimes you can trace the numbers from like one culture to another, and that usually counts as good enough because these numbers are so arcane and they're never based on actual observations anyway. They're always based on recalculation, so the odds that it's simultaneous are nil. So clearly there is contact that's just based on numbers, and yeah, a common numeral system is kind of absolutely necessary. Aaron.
Thanks very much, Robert. I hear what you're saying in part is that Ficino is making astrology more palatable to Nizam.
That's what I think people are saying, yeah.
Can you say more about what happens after Ficino and also in the Northern European context?
Oh, Jesus.
I know your network is.
Yeah,
so you may not be able to.
I'm not.
In the 16th century, you find, in England, for instance,
Yeah.
it is still going on.
Yeah.
Foreman,
Yeah.
John Dee.
Yeah.
I don't know if you make those connections or not.
I don't. But what I think you're saying is, I think something we need to remember. I think it speaks to kind of that's super clear to me. But I think that on one hand, we sometimes think the Renaissance is the beginning of modernity, but it's only happening because they believe in stuff that is really profoundly not modern, like astrology. And this goes on, some of the names you mentioned, John Dee, I mean, he's huge in the history of science to astrology. I mean, and so it's absolutely going on, but I am honestly cutting off the project. Yeah. Sorry, Barbara. Barbara, then, yeah.
I want to ask just a more mundane question, namely, sort of in two parts. One is about the circulation of these texts.
Mhm.
How were how were these texts moving around?
Yeah.
So we don't have Ficino necessarily meeting Ashkenazi.
No, you don't.
But reading.
But his son met him. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But just reading each other's work, right? So, but how are these works
Yeah.
traveling?
Right.
How are they being published, number one? And number two, sort of what is the intended audience for these works? So I was thinking this particularly with the puzzles.
Yeah.
Who is he writing this for?
I don't know. Who would get this? It's very idiosyncratic in that his Hebrew is very strange, right? He's throwing in all these foreign words. He uses Arabic technical terms all the time. He's not a native speaker of Hebrew. He's a native speaker of Greek. I mean, he's fine at Hebrew, but yeah, it's a very weird text, and there's only one copy of it, and the first 40 pages are missing. So you don't have ownerships. You don't have ownership statements. I do know that his son possessed it. Okay, no, not his son, I'm sorry. His only student, a total whack job, right? He has one student. And his student gets, but see, then what happens though? Check this out. So what happens is that manuscript, that manuscript actually ends up in Istanbul and is bought by a Dutch Orientalist in the 1600s. But another thing that happens is that in around 1540, a representative of this famous scholarly merchant family called the Fuggers comes to Crete, and they buy a ton of manuscripts from the people in my network. And one of the things they buy is Urim V'Tumim. So that gets to the Europeans want that. You don't know if there was another copy beforehand, but Ashkenazi's casting horoscopes for well-off Christians. I mean, he must, right, before Urim V'Tumim, right? They buy it. And so a lot of, that's an example of how that text, gets to Europe. A text that Galeano owned about mystical biblical commentary also is bought by the Fuggers. So that's a huge way this stuff gets to Europe. Larry.
During the period you're discussing, there are major political events going on.
Yeah.
In particular, Paul Constantinople
Yeah.
further division by the Ottomans on Central Europe.
Yeah.
The expulsion of the Jews from Spain
Yeah.
and Portugal. Events which you would think create major distrust and hostility among these three communities.
Yeah.
Is that at all evident in, yet they're reading each other's
Yeah.
texts
Yeah.
and borrowing ideas?
Right. Yeah.
Do the politics impinge and
Yes.
affect interpretation?
Yeah, they do. To me, the big drag is that there was between 1508 and I think 1516, but maybe someone in the history department will comment. There's something called the War of the Cambrai in Italy, which is a drag because it destroyed all the archives in Padua for 8 years. So it affects my life. But I think more broadly, I think let's break down this upheaval, right? So one thing you have going on is you've got the Jews being expelled from Iberia. That is a tremendous amount of upheaval, but that's actually good for the project because what you have is then the Sephardic diaspora is kind of swirling around the Mediterranean basin and creating connections. That is, they're going, from Italy, from Spain to Italy to the Ottoman Empire, maybe to Salonika, and maybe around again, maybe a little Crete. So in fact, it's bad for the Jews, but it's sort of good for the project. Okay. Then you have this upheaval about the Ottomans' advances. That's a big deal. obviously, for Christian Europeans. And that, I think, is important because what's also going on is that, I mean, based on some scholarship of my colleagues, is around now is when there's a somewhat emerging kind of consensus, like view that maybe Europe is something like a unit, kind of, and that they're defining themselves against the Ottomans. And so there's a dichotomy, there is a dichotomy emerging between like East and West. And the Turks are East and the Christians are West, and there's a line. And that is one reason I think that means that often the Christians don't always acknowledge Turks, right? Because they're so scared of them. They respect them, but they don't talk about them. They don't always talk about them. But so that in that sense, the Sephardic diaspora, because of the expulsions from Spain, that turns out to be a really important link, because it kind of like the Jews are going across sort of the blood-brain barrier of the kind of Turkish Christian conflict. Do you see what I mean? So one presents a huge historiographical challenge, and then I think and then one is kind of good. Vin.
So this is all a terrestrial-based system for all of these folks, right? Meaning that they're still considering the Earth.
Oh, geocentric.
Geocentric,
Yeah.
sorry. And
Yeah.
I guess my question is, when they're conceiving of these agents of change, that are floating across the sky, what is the exact conception of what those are? They're not thinking of Mercury as being, a quarter the size of mass of the Earth or anything like that. So what are they thinking that these things are, and does that vary contingent on if it's coming out of the Jewish tradition or the Muslim tradition or the Christian?
They think they actually the fact that it's geocentric. I mean, this is that they're still working in an Earth-centered environment doesn't affect a lot of their computational accuracy. That is, they have excellent numbers for not having a telescope. They have extremely good numbers for, say, where a planet will be. Down, they have standards of accuracy down to like a sixth of a degree. And
What do they think those are?
planets, and they think they're planets.
Like the Earth?
Yeah. I mean, they're not, yeah, I mean, they do. They aren't talking about life on them or anything, but they think there are things going around, and they think they do think they're round or spheroid. I mean, they know they're like balls. Yeah. They thought they were carried generally by invisible crystalline spheres or orbs, like hollow spheres. And the physics of that, I mean, there's a whole big story, but that's what they thought brought them around. But so while their ideas about, they're by modern standards, no, they're wrong, obviously, about where the Earth is moving, right? But this actually doesn't matter that much for their applications. You can do a lot. Even someone like Ptolemy could do a lot. And I mean, I think the Islamic stuff is more advanced, obviously. And then sort of the Jewish stuff is next best, and then the Christian stuff is last. And it's going to change, but even by the time I'm looking at even by the 1400s, mid 1400s, late 1400s, the level of astronomy in Europe is ramping up, and they too would be able to compute where a planet's going to be and know that they're not the same size. One of the main problems is they weren't very good at computing distances. Those figures were often off. But in terms of the relative sizes, they weren't too bad. In terms of positions and latitude and longitude in the sky, it's pretty good. Idris?
I have a question regarding the applications, and especially the social applications and the philosophical implications of such applications. Because what struck me was, on the one hand, astrology seems to give individuals a chance to change their behavior, or at least their fate. But religion itself is a very fatalistic kind of discourse, where at least things are predetermined and things. So in a way, is there a tension, or at least have you seen a tension within the righteous you considered? And if so, is there an implication for religious practice more broadly? Are these things happening in the margins of religious practice, or are they shifting the way that people consider change and their faith?
Yeah. I think I think what this is teaching me, I mean, see, it's hard to know because I'm not there. I mean, I think what I mean, no, but you're asking a good question. It's like, what's the impact of this? I think the impact, would be that it teaches us to think about, well, Islam, I mean, I think any of these religions are, in a way, can be very similar theologically. I think it teaches us to think about how we think about religion. And I think that's the lesson, at least to me, that, yeah, people could be fatalistic, but I don't think people were thinking about fate, or at least the people I'm looking at, in the way we do if we think something's fated. It was more just like the deal. But they were also not seeing it so rigid and rationalistically as we might. I'm not saying you're a fatalist, I am, but if we were, you'd have to be kind of all in on it. And they weren't. They thought that things could be, they thought that God would make things happen through the stars. And now that sounds very fatalistic. And indeed, as you may know, in Islam, astrology can be criticized that way because obviously you all know, going back to what Nat's saying, we can totally compute where things are going to be. And therefore, if the planets are running everything's fatal. Everything's fate, exactly. But all these people are saying, though, that because of the interplay of religious piety, there is some give and take here. And and I think that's how they managed to make it work with Judaism and Christianity. I think what you're seeing in Islam, I mean, it's a little, that was kind of the first part of the story. I mean, what you're definitely seeing is that astrology seems to be something that was, accepted at the royal court. This isn't new in the Ottoman Empire, but it definitely means there are different discourses of Islam, right? There's a court one, there might be an elite scholarly one, there might be a, like a Joe Muslim on the street kind of one. Anything else? Other questions? Yeah, please.
Is there a common source for the derived meaning of the individual planets?
No. There are common sources. The origins of astrology it's hard to know where it's starting. I mean, it's starting in part from ancient Babylonian celestial divination practices. There's some of it's coming from ancient Egypt. This gets to the classical world. But once you get to Islam, you have this infusion of material from the Sasanian Empire, too. So it can be very difficult. I mean, it takes the best people in the world to figure out where this stuff is actually coming from. There are many similar sources, but they're just not, they're not all the same. And I mean, like if you're, and even like one handbook, the astrology handbook that I assign in my astrology class, it tells you 3 different ways to compute the ruler of a chart, which is sort of a planet in a very powerful position, because the author is showing off about how much astrology he knows. But it's like, oh, great. Because then the answer is, so how do we do it? And so even one text is sometimes kind of multivalent on, there's some multivalency even in a single text. It's phenomenally complicated. I don't do it. Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming.